The topic that I really wanted to talk about today was, and this is maybe partly because this is one of my last addresses as Chair of the National Water Commission, was about the National Water Initiative itself and its impacts, and also what we're recommending in terms of future action. So what I propose to do is to go conceptual for a moment, talk about the general framework of the National Water Initiative, talk about some of the overarching findings from our 2011 biennial assessment. Then I'm going to drill down into the evidentiary base, which I think is of particular interest to this audience and particular interest to the Murray-Darling Basin, before stepping back to talk about some of our general recommendations. And since I seem to have the old presentation, not the new one that I'd actually brought today, that's entirely my error, I'm sure. I'll not necessarily talk to these slides. So I'll just leave this front one up for a moment. But if I can just start by answering the question, which probably you think you all know the answer, and you probably do, which is, what is the National Water Initiative? It is, because it's been in existence now for such a long time, that people tend to sort of refer to it in the abstract, and I think it's always important to go back to what it's fundamentally about. So the initiative was an agreement between all governments of Australia with the objective of putting forward a very concrete action plan for water reform. And whenever I speak about it, I always read out the objective, because it's so long, but every word matters. And the objective was to achieve a nationally compatible market, regulatory and planning-based system of managing surface and groundwater resources for rural and urban use that optimises social, economic and environmental outcomes. So, as I say, every word counts. But I think the important thing is that it's this system of planning, regulation and markets. And the intent was that the planning would give rise to water access entitlements, which would have a degree of security, which meant that they could be traded in markets, and the side effects of their use would be regulated. So that would be dealt with through regulation rather than through the entitlement system. And that also that the environment, the entitlements for the environment would have similar standing to entitlements for consumptive use. So that was the general sort of schema. So when we came to do the 2011 biennial assessment, we were really focusing for the first time not just on whether governments had done the things they said they were going to do in the initiative and the agreement, but what were the outcomes. And so our assessment was based on, of course, you know, those outcomes. Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much. Right, so that was the architecture that I was talking about, and here we go. Now we're in business. So the assessment was based on these four areas of whether or not the outcomes were as had been anticipated. Had the initiative, actions under the initiative, contributed to better governance of the water resource, which is the sort of underpinning architecture? Had it contributed to productive and efficient water use? Was there an improvement in the sustainability of water management, bringing benefits for the environment? And was it contributing to the resilience of communities? So that seemed to cover the sort of bases. And if I can just sort of go through with, and you know, we never like to do scorecards in the Commission because there's always a lot of nuance and subtlety, but nevertheless, I'll do this for today's purposes, where we got to. First of all, on governance, we'd give it a small tick. Fundamentally, a lot of the legislative changes that were required have been passed, with a notable exception of Western Australia and Northern Territory, who, to their loss in our view, have not yet passed National Water Initiative compliant, consistent legislation. But generally those frameworks are in place, and there have been advances in the institutional arrangements that have been generally beneficial, and some quite significant changes, including, of course, the formation of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. So we give that, you know, there's some nuance. It's not all roses, but there's certainly been significant advances. The next question was productivity and the economic benefits, and we give that a very big tick too, and I'm going to talk about that in more detail in a minute. But really, the guts of it is the centrepiece has been the impacts of trade, and we have very ample evidence of the benefits that have flowed from that in the economic sphere, and actually in other spheres as well, but particularly economics. So that is a big tick. Moving on to sustainable water management, though, I have to say in my son's language, it's a fail. And the reason that it's a fail is because when you read the language of the National Water Initiative, and in fact language that's replicated in the Water Act, which is about returning overused and over-allocated systems to a sustainable level of extraction, not only has that not been done, there has not been agreement about what any of those words mean, and certainly in some jurisdictions there is still really a refusal to measure or to say, well, actually, we think this system is over-allocated or over-extracted. So for whatever reason, despite the fact they all signed up to this, it's been an extraordinarily difficult thing to get to grips with and execute. So that's one reason that it's a fail. But another reason that it's a fail is because although a lot actually has been done to return water to the environment, and there are new institutions and environmental water managers and lots of good progress, the measuring and monitoring of the impact and the understanding of the science, which would tell you that this hydrological activity will lead to this ecological response, is still very, very patchy, and so it's actually extremely difficult when we look into the evidence base to say what the impact has been. So it's not that we're saying necessarily the impacts haven't been there, but it really is very hard to get the evidence of it. And it's only really in very recent times, and certainly not happening universally, that water plans are becoming clear about what the objectives and targets for the environment. So the plan talks about how the water is to be managed and allocated, but doesn't actually get to what it's there to achieve from an environmental perspective. So that is why we, overall, I would say, the progress has been disappointing to say the least. And in that context, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is an extraordinarily important opportunity. We can understand, completely the difficulties and the reason why it's controversial and the reason why it's so hard to get the underpinning science not just done but communicated and all of that. But it is a great opportunity to turn the corner on tackling that central question of sustainable levels of extraction. So we are not just supportive of the efforts of the authority, but also say quite strongly that this is addressing ourselves to COAG and the jurisdictions really. Everybody, all the parties who have an interest in this, they roll up your sleeves and get involved and help bring that process to a conclusion. It's very troubling when you see evidence of people just standing back and sort of waiting for something to happen. Everybody who has a stake in this really needs to get involved and support that process. And then the final point in resilient communities, it's a bit of a maybe. And again, there's two reasons for the maybe. The first reason is because, again, the evidence isn't actually that strong. And when it comes down to it, despite and absolutely understandably all the concerns that there are in the communities about the potential impact of big changes in water availability and water use in their communities and the economies on which they depend. When you actually look at what's happened, the big changes that have been driven in rural and regional communities have been as a consequence of other factors than changes in the water, the way that water is managed and used. So the evidence doesn't really show strong impacts in either direction, it has to be said. They're almost independent variables. So there's a bit of a question mark over that. But the other thing that there's a question mark about, and again, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority has centre stage in this, but they're not the only players by any means, is there's a real question about community engagement and trust. And this applies much more widely, I have to say, than in water. And social licence to operate, as an expression, applies in so many industries. But here, where the architecture of what you do is based on a planning process that's an engaged process and everything else flows from that, community engagement and trust and belief in the outcome obviously is incredibly important, and you just can't underestimate the effort that is required in order to produce that. We've seen some very good examples when we were doing our assessment, but we also saw some areas of weakness where really more needs to be done. So going from that, I just wanted then to drill down into what has been very much a centrepiece of the achievements of the National Water Initiative, and that has been the impact of water trade. And what I think has been in quite a short period of time, an extraordinary journey in terms of the change of sentiments towards trade as being a threat, towards it being a real source of opportunity and economic value. And I'm sure many of you have now seen this chart or something similar that shows how water trade has grown in the southern Murray-Darling Basin, which is really obviously where the market is most extensive and most effective over the last couple of decades. And there's a couple of important points I think you can see in this. First of all, up until 95, really both allocation and entitlement trade were very small. And then there was this dramatic increase in 1995, and I'm sure that those of you who've got a good sense of history in the basin will realise that's because that was an impact of the interim cap being applied. And that really, if there's no scarcity, if there's no cap, there's no trade. It really drove a response. And at the time, really all that you could do was trade on the temporary market. And so that happened in quite significant volumes and very much in response to seasonal conditions, exactly as you'd expect. I've always said the water market is actually the economist's dream because it always behaves exactly as you would expect. It's been fantastic where it's unconstrained. So the big difference that really happened as a consequence of the National Water Initiative and the efforts that were made since then was this shift towards entitlement trade, and you can see that really taking off in 2007. The 2007-8 season and thereafter. And I think just one of the important points of this chart, there are many important things but that I won't dwell on given the time, is you can see in here the pink zone is the what we've called titled entitlement trade to the environment, and of course that's primarily the Australian government's water purchases. And although they are big, they're a significant proportion, I think it's also, this is very important because it also shows how much trade was also simultaneously happening between irrigators, and that the intervention in terms of the buybacks is substantial, but it's not dominating the market. And the other thing that probably is not clear from this is really how much that market has been constrained. So when we put the National Water Initiative in place, and there were, these various rules which were supposed to smooth the transition, the 4% rule, the 10% rule, and so on. It had really been the view of people that they wouldn't bite, but the conditions were such by the time that entitlement trade took off that they did begin to bite. And so the removal of the 10% limit on non-water users' ownership of entitlements in Victoria, for example, is a very important a shift in terms of reducing the constraints on trade.